Bill Ayers may be best known as one of the founders of the group The Weather Underground, which staunchly opposed the Vietnam War and dreamed of overthrowing the U.S. government. He got into some pretty serious legal trouble when he was linked to anti-government bombings, but those charges were ultimately dropped because of illegal evidence gathering. Fast forward to a decade or so later, Ayers became a professor in Chicago. He focused on education reform, and in the 1990s, he served as an advisor to Chicago Mayor Richard Daley. His new book is You Can't Fire the Bad Ones, and 18 Other Myths about teachers, teachers' unions, and public education. And Bill Ayers joins me now. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Why did you decide to write this book at this particular point in time?
Well, I felt that I joined with my brother and one of my star students, so it's co-written with two others, but we felt that it was time to intervene in the political discussion going on about schools, and corporate school reform has kind of dominated the discussion for the last 3 decades, really. And it's been a bipartisan effort. It's been supported by all the major media, foundations, corporations, all are on board with this corporate agenda. We felt we wanted to intervene in that discussion.
Now, when you say corporate education reform, I just want to make sure that viewers know what you're talking about. You're talking about what some people would call the charter school movement, right? Or am I conflating a couple?
Well, charters are part of it, and that's a recent iteration of it. But yeah, corporate school reform is basically the agenda of Arne Duncan and Betsy DeVos. It's the agenda of the Gates Foundation and the New York Times. So it's kind of got the big megaphone. But what it is really an agenda that stands on 3 legs. One is the reduction of education to a single metric, the standardized test score. Second is to eliminate any collective voice of teachers. Very anti-union. And 3 is to privatize the public space. So yes, charters, vouchers, those things come into play. And all 3 of those things are, we think, a great danger to a great American ideal, which is public education.
As you see this conception of education that you vigorously disagree with gaining momentum, what do you attribute that gain in momentum to? I know there's been a lot of money spent by people who have the vision that you described. I have wondered if that money could get the results it's gotten if there wasn't a sense among, I was going to say consumers of the public education system, but right there I'm buying into
yes.
So among parents with kids in public schools, if there weren't some sort of deep dissatisfaction with the status quo. So why do you think momentum has been building?
I don't think momentum is building. I think momentum is stalled, but I think you're absolutely right that to the extent that it captures an audience, it captures that audience because of dissatisfaction with the status quo. And I'm dissatisfied with the status quo. The problem is the way, for example, the New Yorker describes the problem is they say there are 2 camps in the school reform world. One is the revolutionaries, and those are the corporate reformers and the privatizers. And 2 is the status quo crowd, the liberal, status quo group, and that's the unions and the colleges of education. I disagree. I'm not in either camp. But the reality is that people have been and are dissatisfied with many, many public schools, and appropriately so. But the corporate school reform agenda, which has grown and grown and grown, actually has stalled, and people are now, with the big megaphone and all the money, in 3 decades, they have not won over parents, they have not won over teachers, they have not won over kids or communities. So it's really a contested space, and we ought to contest it. That's what this book does.
I want to ask you talked about Arne Duncan and Betsy DeVos a moment ago. I want to ask you to compare those 2, but before I do that, you've got 19 total myths that you've identified here. We've probably got time to talk about 2 or 3. What are the 3 most pernicious or damaging? Give me 2 or 3 really, really destructive, as you see it, myths about the way public education
works. Some of the myths are policy oriented, and some are classroom oriented. So I would say that if you just look at any politician who gets to a microphone, one of the things they will always say as part of their stump speech is we need to get the lazy, incompetent teachers out of the classroom. Everybody nods dully, even me. What am I going to do? Say, no, keep those lazy ones there for my granddaughters. Of course, if you frame it that way. But the reality is that's not the problem we're facing. So if I get to the microphone first, I'm going to say every kid deserves a public school in his or her neighborhood, someplace that he or she can walk to. And that school should be fully funded, fully resourced, with smart, caring, ethically grounded, intellectually interesting teachers who are well rested and well paid. I win that argument. So the question is, what is the real problem? The corporate school reformers hate to talk about, for example, one of the elephants in the room, which is poverty. So that's really one of the problems we have to talk about, and to ignore it is ridiculous. But the other thing that I think is more pernicious is that the corporate school reform crowd, and I'll just use Arne Duncan as one example, who's a good guy in many ways, but I think on this he's dead wrong. They would never have for their own children what they're demanding the schools look like for other people's children. Arne Duncan's kids go to private school. Betsy DeVos.
Do they go to the Chicago Lab schools?
University of Chicago Laboratory schools. And it's a lovely school, and I don't fault him for it. What I fault him for is saying the rest of you can have a school that's his school, lab school, has small classes, a full arts program, a curriculum based in part on kids' interests. That's what every kid deserves. So why is it just the privileged who get those things? We should demand it for all kids.
So in terms of, and we won't have time to get into them, unfortunately, the notion that you cannot fire bad teachers, that's your number 2 myth, am I correct?
I think so, something
like that.
Okay,
yeah. Just throw out a couple others, a couple other premises of corporate ed reform, as you put it, that are just off.
Well, let's start with you can't fire the bad ones. We talk about a New Yorker profile that was done of a thing called the Rubber Rooms.
I remember that piece.
Yeah, and it's a story about 15 teachers who are awaiting adjudication
in New York City.
Yeah.
They can't be canned, so they just sit there.
Well, they can be canned, but it takes due process, and that's appropriate. Due process is how you fire somebody. But it's 15 teachers, 0.0005% of the New York City teachers, and it warrants an entire profile in the New Yorker. The reality is that teachers' union contracts are good things because good working conditions make good teaching conditions, and good teaching conditions make good learning conditions. There's almost nothing you can name, from small class size to arts and sports, that's not good for kids and also good for teachers.
I can already tell I'm going to have about a quarter of the time I wanted to have with you, so I'm going to rush ahead. People who want to identify all of the myths that you identify can grab the book, maybe buy the book. I'm curious about what you think the intent is on the part of corporate ed reformers. Do you think their intentions are good and their solutions just horribly misguided? Or I feel like I've seen this in some people who are with you in the pushback. Are their intentions actually nefarious? Where do you come down? Or does it even matter?
I don't think it does matter, and I think you'd have to ask them, and I'm sure it's various. I'm sure the range of motivations are various. I think reducing education to a single metric, a standardized test score, is devastating. I think some people think it's reasonable as a way to measure education. But again, the privileged would never allow that for their own children. And the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools has about a third of the tests that the Chicago public schools have. So, yeah, I think that's a bad one. In terms of privatizing the public space, I think that's nefarious. I think the idea that education is a product to be sold at the marketplace as opposed to a human right is a terrible, terrible direction.
Do you see the Trump administration and Betsy DeVos as no more problematic for the educational vision you'd like to see than President Obama and Arne Duncan? Or is there a level of threat to what you want to see exist that is greater since President Trump?
Well, I think in almost every arena, the Trump administration has ratcheted things up in a negative direction. So in terms of school reform, to go from charters, which have proven to be disastrous in the main, to vouchers is catastrophic. To take money away from the public schools and give it to the religious schools just belies everything we know about what makes a free democratic society. So yeah, I think it's gone a step further, but no, I don't think Arne Duncan's in any position to represent the opposition because he's gone along this road for 3 decades.
The backstage team is going to yell at me. I got to sneak in one more huge question, and you'll have 15 seconds to answer it. You were part of the conservative backlash to President Obama before he was elected.
Conservative backlash?
Yes. Well, am I?
I was part of the conservative backlash?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of conservatives seized on.
I was used.
Yes. No. I wasn't saying that you were driving the conservative backlash. You figured in the conservative backlash to President Obama.
Yeah, I was one of the poster children.
One of the poster children. Are you surprised that backlash continued, not just after he was elected, but while he was president, governing, I would say, as a moderate Democrat, and continued through his presidency to the point where it yielded, I would again argue, the presidency of Donald Trump?
Yeah, I'm not surprised because I think we have in our country a base for kind of a nativist, white supremacist politics, and we always have had that. And the problem is, for me, the problem is that base has not been as coherent in about 50 years. I mean, George Wallace was the last leader who cohered that base. So on one level, it's not surprising. It is terrible and tragic. But my feeling about Obama is exactly what you said. He was a middle-of-the-road, pragmatic politician. That's always what he said. That's exactly how he governed. The right wing wanted to say he was a secret Muslim with socialist tendency, and a black nationalist, none of which was true. The left wing team seemed to think he's winking at me, but he wasn't. He is a moderate, pragmatic guy, and also a compassionate and decent and deeply intelligent guy.
If you are still around in the guest room after the show, I would love to continue this conversation.
We
Bill
will
Ayers, thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That book, again, is You Can't Fire the Bad Ones, and 18 Other Myths About Teachers, Teachers' Unions, and Public Education.